Hello, I'm Robert, voluntary fact checker and helping you if you're scared of many things. And this is to help people who are scared about Ukraine firing shells back over the border from Ukraine into Russia. I want to explain why this is very safe for the UK and likely eventually the United States to permit Ukraine to fire weapons across the border into Russia. This is just self-defense. Indeed, here it is Russia that is not permitted under international law to fire shells into Ukraine because it's the attacker. And it is trying to take Ukrainian territory, and that is not permitted under the UN Charter. Whereas Ukraine, as the country that is being attacked, it is the country that has the legitimate right to fire its weapons the other way into Russia in order to prevent these attacks. And when the fighter jets in Russia that are launching on missions to drop bombs over Ukraine, then Ukraine has every right to attack those fighter jets on the ground in the airports where they're waiting to taxi off and then fly over to Ukraine and drop bombs on them. And there is nothing in international law to stop you from attacking a fighter jet that you know is about to take off and drop bombs on your country. That makes no sense to make that a rule. So it is Russia that should stop under international law. It should stop this invasion right away. And it's Ukraine that under international law has the legitimate right for self-defense to prevent Russia from attacking it and do whatever is necessary to do that. So this is why it is totally legal and absolutely safe and absolutely correct for a country that wants to help Ukraine and supply it with weapons. Never normally happens that the country that supplies a country with weapons to defend itself will tell that country, but you can only use those weapons against your own territory. That makes no sense. Why would they only use the weapons against their own territory when it's another country that's invading them? How does that make sense? It doesn't. So it's a very, very bizarre situation that this rule has ever been in place in the first place. It is not a normal rule of armed conduct. Nothing to do with international law, nothing ethical, nothing normal in a political sense. There's no reason for this rule. It's a very bizarre rule. Now, the reason it's come to a head just now is because Russia is attacking across the border and this is Russia's territory, this is Ukraine, and it's attacking across the border in Kharkiv Oblast. And it did this, of course, in 2022. The only way it could get into Ukraine was by crossing the border. But back then, Ukraine didn't have any NATO shells. It had no support from NATO whatsoever, except for the Javelin anti-tank missiles, which are not much use, except for quite very, very short range, and it didn't even try to stop Russia from crossing its border with those. And the Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, those weren't any use for stopping Russia from crossing the border. So there was nothing that it could do with NATO missiles, and all it had was its Soviet-era shells and Soviet-era artillery, which had quite a lot of at that time in 2022. And then by the time it got the M77 howitzers, later in 2022, all the fighting was internal to Ukraine. And then eventually it did this very surprise liberation of the Kharkiv Oblast, and all the advances in 2022 were, the only one that was anywhere near the border was the Kharkiv Oblast liberation. That was Ukraine that did that, not Russia. So there was nothing involving the border where Ukraine was on the defensive after it got the NATO weapons. And as far as I know, from then to today, I don't think there's been any attacks by Russia until just recently. So that is why it's hitting the news and why countries are changing their decisions. So the United Kingdom decided a week ago, and it told Ukraine, okay, you can now use our weapons across the border. But United Kingdom doesn't really supply Ukraine with significant numbers of shells, and it's the same. The Jens Stoltenberg has said that NATO countries should give give Ukraine permission to use its weapons across the border. He's the head of NATO defense forces. But almost all the shells now that Ukraine is using are from the United States, and so it needs permission from the United States to fire back. And the United States isn't giving us permission yet. But it likely will in the near future. It might do it quite quickly. There's a huge amount of pressure on Biden. And just to say, the US Congress, it's not a restriction from the US Congress. US Congress gave these missiles, approved the bill to fund Ukraine with no restrictions on how Ukraine uses the missiles. And members of Congress, including Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who was so slow in letting the bill through, and he was very cautious, and he wanted it because of his preoccupation with border and the border with Mexico. He is one of the people now who is saying this is a nonsense restriction, please drop it. So the US Congress is telling the Biden, please drop this restriction. So it's a restriction that only comes from the president at this stage in the United States. Biden has always been super, very, very cautious throughout the war. And it's because of Biden is so cautious that he's not yet lifted this restriction. But he's near certain to eventually. And so this is to help explain to you why there's nothing to worry about when he does that. It's absolutely normal. This is the normal situation in warfare, that the invaded country can do that. And there's nothing Putin's going to do nothing. I'll talk about that in more detail in a bit. So to help you understand this, think about when the United States, if you know your US history, you will know that the United States invaded Canada in 1812 with the aim to liberate the Canadians from Britain. And the Canadians didn't want to be liberated. So it's not that different situation. Of course, in this case, Russia is trying to liberate Ukrainians from Zelensky, which is even more nonsense. It's really, which is not doesn't actually make sense at all, really. But and even the Russia supporting Russians in Ukraine don't like being bombed, with the aim of liberating them from Zelensky, who most of them voted for, because he got a very high level of vote, he's a Russian speaker himself. So it's a very strange situation in Ukraine, where Putin claims to be liberating Russians in Ukraine from Zelensky, who they voted for. So that's a bizarre war, that one. Anyway, in the United States, then with this war in 1812, United States invaded Canada in order to liberate it from the British, which they didn't want to be liberated, most of them. And in that situation, of course, the Canadians then fought back. And this long before the UN Charter, but just accepted that if you're invaded, you fight back. And these are one of the cannons that they fired. So if you just try to put this in perspective, would it be, if you imagine a Canadian just the other side of this river during that war, then should the British have told Canada, its colony, and told Canada, you must not fire back into the United States, just fire against US soldiers when they are in Canada? That would have made no sense, wouldn't it? Be totally nonsensical instruction. And of course there was no such instruction, and they did fire across back into when they had much limited range of only 1,200 yards, but still, when there was something within that range, they would fire at it. If they were attacking. Actually, in that war, the British ended up taking back in Canada and South of America and south of the United States, they ended up taking back quite large areas from time to time back from the United States. So they fought back the other way. But Ukraine isn't doing that. So Ukraine stops. So this is now a different situation. UN Charter, modern wars, where borders are much more respected, and the Ukrainian soldiers, they stop at exactly at the former border between Ukraine and Russia. So this was after I talked about them liberating Kharkiv Oblast. They liberated quite a bit of it in May 2022, and they liberated the rest, a very large area of it, in the fall of 2022, autumn 2022. And this is from the first time that they managed to liberate some of the occupied area of Kharkiv Oblast in May 2022, and they got as far as the border between Ukraine and Russia, and that was their target. And then they stopped there, and they put in the border post, and this was a great victory for them to reach the former border between Ukraine and Russia. And then they just put the post in, and it didn't go even 1 meter beyond where the border was. They'd have used GPS or something to work out where it should be put. They just put it there, and then that was it. They never went any further than that. So unlike the situation in the 1812 between United States and Canada, Canada did sometimes take small areas and sometimes even larger areas back from the United States in the war, and then it went back and forth until eventually it settled along the current line between Canada and the United States. But in Ukraine, there's nothing like that going on. Ukraine is just pushing back to the 2014 border, and then the international border up to 2014, and then it stops along those lines, and it doesn't go even a meter further. So it's a very, very, very clear case of an illegal war and Ukraine doing legitimate self-defense. Now, this is an awful mistake that the New York Times did. So Ukraine has never targeted civilians in Russia. Russia is frequently firing its bombs at skyscrapers and apartment blocks and hotels and malls and things like that, railway stations where there are civilians, and it's done that all through the war. Ukraine never does that. So the New York Times put this on its story, the one that is scaring people, that I'm debunking here. It has this picture of an apartment in Belgorod which has been hit, and obviously some people must have been killed when that bomb hit this apartment in Belgorod. And the caption for it by the New York Times says that it's the aftermath of a Ukrainian attack. You can see down there. It was not. This has nothing to do with Ukraine. So the background here is that all through the war we've had these stories of the Russian bombers dropping their bombs by mistake. And often it's just in an open field or something, but sometimes it lands in places where it harms people. And these stories happened over and over again. So it's either mistakes by the pilots, or it's some mechanical problem or whatever, but it's a frequent recurring problem of the Russian bombers. And this was one of those where it seems to have been a glide bomb that because it came in at an angle from the Russian side, not the Ukrainian side. And it behaved like a glide bomb, hit the apartment, and so open source intelligence, based on the information they have, and their best guess is that it was a Russian bomber that accidentally was on its way to drop a glide bomb on Ukraine, and it's accidentally dropped it too soon, and it then hit this apartment block in Belgorod. And New York Times, there's that's consensus amongst all the open source intelligence as to that's what's happened there. And New York Times, it got a caption from Getty Images. It's Getty Images that gave it a wrong caption. Getty Images seems to have got its caption from Russian propaganda and just copied over what the Russian propaganda said and put it as the caption of the image. And then New York Times has summarised that, and just some staffer at New York Times got this thing from Getty Images, which is normally reasonably authoritative, and got it wrong because Getty Images got it wrong. So that is very misleading and extremely mistaken. And Ukraine does not attack civilians in Russia. So I explained that. It doesn't make US a combatant. It just makes the US is just a supplier. So Ukraine, no, I haven't quite explained this. Ukraine has the legitimate right to self-defense under Article 51, and then USA, by supplying weapons to Ukraine, it is not a combatant. It's not fighting Russia. It is just supplying Ukraine with what it needs to exercise its own legitimate right of self-defense. So there's nothing in that in any way to make the United States a combatant in any way. In the same way that Iran and North Korea are not combatants on the Russian side in any way. They're just supplying Russia with its weapons for its illegitimate invasion of Ukraine. Well, US is doing it as legitimate self-defense. Here's what Jens Stoltenberg said, so let's go and look at that. Self-defense is enshrined in the UN Charter. It's legal, it's legitimate, and we're helping Ukraine with upholding that right, and that should include the ability to also strike targets on Russian territory when there are military legitimate targets we're talking about. So, of course, US would not support Ukraine using them against civilians or against using them to try to take any territory back from Russia. But they don't need to worry about that because Ukraine has never done that. So they're supporting Ukraine in its legitimate right of self-defense. There can be mistakes, of course, sometimes, but as long as Ukraine is doing its very best not to harm civilians when it's attacking Russia, then that's legitimate self-defense. So then he has this list of things. They need to lift their restrictions. How can Ukraine defend itself? It's not permitted to use the against targets in Russia. In places in Kharkiv, the border between Russia and Ukraine is also the battlefield front line. If you don't give permission to Ukraine, this is my summary of what he said, paraphrased to make it a bit shorter than the actual he used more words than this. If you don't give Ukraine permission to fire weapons over to the Russian side of the front line, make it far harder for Ukraine to defend itself, and it's enshrined in the UN Charter. So that's what he said, and this is the actual transcript. As you see, it's quite a bit longer than my points, shortened points of it. And here's, as I told Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, and he says they need to be able to fight back. And I think us trying to micromanage the effort there, it's not a good policy for us. So that's the House that passed the bill, and the Speaker of the House telling Biden, we do not support these restrictions, we did not put those restrictions on the missiles, please lift them. And this is the Helsinki Commission, and chairman of the House of Foreign Affairs Committee, that's the Helsinki Commission, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee also with the same message. And here's Boris Johnson, and he's saying it's absolutely ludicrous that Ukrainians should be forbidden from doing what Putin is doing himself in attacking Ukrainian forces. So Putin is illegitimately attacking Ukraine and firing lots and lots of missiles at Ukraine from Russia. Many of them are fired from Russia, from planes that never even crossed the border into Ukraine. So it's absolutely ludicrous that Ukrainians should be forbidden from doing what Putin is doing himself, which is not legitimate. What Ukraine is doing is legitimate. Why on earth shouldn't Ukrainians be able to attack Russian forces mustering on their borders, as they did in Kharkiv for some weeks I think it was some months, some weeks, for the really mustering in a big way just across the border, and the Ukrainians could see they were getting ready to attack, and they weren't allowed to attack back. This is about just how bizarre Putin's restrictions are. So if Putin's is trying to prevent NATO from sending decades-old equipment, like ATACMS is from the 1980s, the F-16s are from the 1970s. And if Putin felt he could get away with it, he would tell NATO, you can only supply Ukraine with historically accurate Roman chariots. If he could get away with it, that's what he'd say. There's no point in this. There's no sense in this. His red lines are arbitrary and totally ludicrous. And the reason he is trying to stop NATO from supplying 1970s technology and 1980s technology to Ukraine is because it is equal and in some respects superior to 2020s technology that Russia has. Because after the Soviet Union, NATO's technology accelerated hugely, but Russia, when the breakup of the Soviet Union, then a lot of the defense industrial base of the Soviet Union ended up in NATO. Russia has a far smaller economy, and a lot of its finance, which it did put into defense, was siphoned off by oligarchs that just put it into their pockets and didn't use it to make the defense projects they were supposed to be making with all that money. And this is why Russia is so behind in terms of technology. Even if it weren't for the oligarchs, it would have been way behind NATO, and then that makes it even worse. So Russia has lots of things that look good on paper, but they've just not been done properly, not been completed, never been done, never completed. And the ones that are completed take ages and long time to get working, and they don't work very well. And it's still trying to do its 4th generation fighter jet, while the United States is working on its 5th generation fighter jet. And its 4th generation fighter jet is mature technology, the F-35, been fighting for a long time. I'll come to that in a minute. So, yes, this is an example that, so the UK has dropped its restrictions against using the Storm Shadow against Russia now, but it never, so Putin was trying to get NATO countries to not permit Ukraine to attack Crimea. And first of all, it was just saying, don't send the long-range HIMARS, just send short-range ones. This would ensure that Ukraine couldn't fire them far enough to reach Crimea. And Crimea, Ukraine still managed to fire some things into Crimea, and Putin said it's like a red line, and he then just, when the Ukraine attacked the Saki airbase with big explosions in not that late, not that far into 2022, I can't remember when it was it summer or something, I can't remember. I think it was the summer, where they're all holidaying on the beach, and with these explosions behind them, the Russian holiday goers on the beach. And the Russia just said, these are accidents. They're smoking accidents by the Russians, when everyone knows it was actually bombs being dropped in some way, not really known to this day how they did it, and by Ukraine. Possibly some missile system prototype they had, we've got very few models of it left, so that could reach that far. So that was the first attack on Crimea, and Putin just pretended it wasn't happening. So that's how he does his red lines. He typically, and for a long time, he just pretended that nothing was happening as Ukraine hit Crimea over and over. And then eventually, well, it just doesn't enter into the news hardly at all, but he doesn't say anything when these things happen. So this now is getting to 2023. The UK gave Ukraine the Storm Shadow cruise missile, which has enough range to hit throughout Crimea from Ukrainian territory. And the Ukraine has used it against radar systems and things like that in Crimea, and it helped to degrade the air defences in Crimea to the extent that Russia is no longer be able to stop things from attacking it. And this makes things much easier for the ATACMS now, which have hit Crimea several times since Russia, even in the last week or two, and destroyed quite a lot of things there. And ATACMS is destroying lots of air defence systems, including Russia's most modern S-400 air defence system. Every week we get one or two of those being destroyed by the ATACMS. And so anyway, a year ago today, and a bit more than that, then I think it was about a year ago today, I'm not sure when exactly, when the storm, it was a year ago and a bit further back, a bit earlier in May, in 2023, that Ukraine first got delivery of the Storm Shadow, and then a few weeks later that they hit the Rostov-on-Don, the nuclear submarine. So the Ukraine used the UK Storm Shadow to destroy a nuclear submarine in dry docks in Sevastopol harbour. And Putin, it wasn't in the news. He just didn't make anything of it. And this means one less submarine that can to fire missiles, and Russia can't supply any more submarines into the Black Sea because Turkey doesn't allow them through the Bosphorus Strait. And in total, Ukraine has sunk a quarter of the Black Sea fleet so far in the war in 2 years, and it's continuing to sink them. And with the ATACMS, Russia's had to retreat all the way out of Crimea with most of its Black Sea fleet, or it would have lost a whole lot more than just a quarter. So that happened in 2023, and there were big losses by Russia in 2023. They didn't hit the news much, and a lot of them were because of Storm Shadow from the UK, and Putin did nothing. So he is not going to do anything when, now that UK has lifted the restriction on Storm Shadow hitting Russia, just like with Crimea, he's not going to do anything because they're going to be legitimate defensive targets that it hits, just like this submarine was, because the submarine fires missiles at Ukraine. The first submarine that Russia's lost in decades, and destroyed by a country that doesn't even have a navy, using the UK Storm Shadow. So I just want to make another thing clear. UK and US, they're not going to become a combatant, but for a point of clarity, even if they are a combatant, there's no way that Russia would attack UK if the UK sent soldiers to fight in Ukraine. That makes absolutely no sense. So the UK has been a combatant in many wars in the last century and this century, including a war for its own territory with the Falkland Islands with Argentina. But that didn't lead to Argentina attacking UK. It only attacked the Falkland Islands. It wouldn't have made sense. It would have been totally stupid for Argentina to set off on an expedition to try and attack the UK in some way. We have no chance. And in the same way, UK has been involved in Afghanistan. It's been involved in wars in the Middle East, in Iraq War. None of these wars have led to any attacks by anyone on UK, because UK is too strongly defended by NATO, and none of these wars have involved NATO in any way, it doesn't involve the treaty of NATO, none of these wars. So it's not going to happen. But the reason that UK is not sending, so UK is not timid like the other NATO countries. The reason UK is not sending soldiers to Ukraine is because they don't need them. It's made it very clear that it's not sending soldiers to Ukraine because Ukraine doesn't need the UK soldiers. Now, if this was a country like Moldova, a small, weak country, now Moldova is protected because it's got the big mass of Ukraine between it and Russia. But suppose it was a small country like Moldova and it asked for the UK's help, then UK would send soldiers there, and there's no way that Russia would attack UK in that situation. So is not a combatant from UK's point of view, just simply because it doesn't need to be, and it never will need to be. There's no possibility of UK getting involved as a combatant because Ukraine has plenty of soldiers. We'll see more details about that in a minute. But it's just, the UN treaty is not targeted either. We'll come to that in a minute too. UN treaty is not targeted by in that situation either. Yes, because if Russia attacked UK, other NATO countries would be obligated to help UK if it asked for their help. And that's the last thing Russia wants. So now, this is to talk about why Russia will never attack NATO, because NATO is just vastly more powerful. Its weapons are so much more powerful that for Russia to use its missiles against UK would be like using soap bubbles. You're going to talk, and it would make no sense for Putin to use its nukes. So I'll talk about that in a minute too. But if you look at the conventional, then there's it's just like using soap bubbles. So we look at the F-35. I talked about how the fourth generation fighter jet, how the NATO has the F-35. F-35 is essentially invisible. It's like a supersonic potato as far as the radar is concerned. It's not very big at all, its radar reflection, because it is built up from the ground up. The first fighter jet to be built from the ground up from materials that radar can't see. And so it's got all that confuse the radar so the radar can't see it, either because it just goes through the materials or because the materials just confuse the radar so the radar just behaves as if there's nothing there from the point of view of the radar transmitter. So it's so invisible to radar. Actually, the US must be working on radar to try and detect its own F-35, but it's really quite hard for US radar to detect his own fighter jets. There was one of the US F-35 fighter jets, they had a kind of in-air accident where the pilot had to bail out, and he forgot to, or wasn't able to keep put his transponder on before this happened. So it flew under autopilot for tens of kilometers across the United States, and the US couldn't track it. And so he set out an alert to the US population saying, if you happen to spot an F-35 plane crash in your area, please let us know, because we don't know where our F-35 is. So these would be very, very hard for you, only if it's very close that you could spot it. And they spot this radar reflection of what looks like a supersonic potato, and they say, that's a bit weird, that might be an F-35. But only if it's very, very close. So the Russians would, the F-35, they're vastly superior to anything that the Ukrainians have, the Russians have. It's an F-35 pilot, and he, a retired F-35 pilot, and he said that there's just no way that that Russia could defend against the F-35. An F-35 would very quickly have air superiority over the whole of the occupied area of Ukraine if NATO was to use F-35s there, which it's not going to do. It's going to supply these decades-old 1970s F-16s, which will bring Ukraine up to parity with Russia. They're not going to supply Ukraine with F-35s. They could have trained the Ukrainian pilots so they started at the beginning of the war, and they would know how to fly F-35s. They're not going to do that. So, and they're not going to, and they could send them and then allow volunteers from ex-F-35 pilots, like this retired one I talked about. They could allow those to fly them for Ukraine in the Ukrainian army. They're not going to do that. So NATO is very, very cautious with its technology. It just doesn't. It's not giving Ukraine. It's only very, very slowly and reluctantly going to give Ukraine 1970s F-35s. Of course, they're improved with quite a lot of technology since then, but the basic frame, the aircraft itself, is 1970s technology. And they're going to get it maybe some this summer, and then a few more in the fall, and then going through to 2025. And this may be quite a major change in the war, because Russia has 10 times as many fighter jets as Ukraine, and it has 4,000 aircraft altogether, including all its military aircraft, and Ukraine is on dozens, about 50 or so or something. So everyone was predicting that Russia would take over the Ukrainian airspace very quickly, within a few days. But it didn't. It couldn't. And it turned out, to everyone's surprise, NATO didn't realize how weak Russia was in the air. So it turned out that Russia has never needed to go beyond World War II, the World War II fighting techniques for its pilots, which is where a general says to a pilot, drop a bomb there, and they fly off and they drop that bomb. And that's essentially all that the Russian pilots know how to do. They don't know how to do the kind of working together as a team to take over the enemy airspace. And Ukraine do know how to do that sort of thing. They have been training, they've got somewhat Soviet era mentality, but they've been training since 2014, when they started doing cross-training, not supply of weapons, but cross-training with NATO, because of what happened when Russia took over Crimea, and Ukrainians started doing exercises with NATO, and lots of training, and saying, we need to know how to fight. And so NATO trained them with up-to-date techniques, and both on the battlefield and in the air, Ukraine is very superior in their technique and their strategy to the Russians, which are still stuck in essentially World War II mindsets. So the F-16s may make more of a difference than the NATO allies expect, because Ukraine, because of its being better at piloting, and it has to be, for 50 or so fighter jets to hold off 10 times their number, they have to be better pilots. It's obvious. So the Ukrainians are much better pilots than the Russians, because they're trained in modern piloting, and they don't have this World War II mindset. So the F-16s might make quite a big difference to Ukraine when they arrive. But we can see from this that Russia is just so far behind NATO, and we didn't know this until the start of this war. We knew that they were behind technologically. There were examples of the Tomahawk going straight through the Russian air defences without them being able to stop it. So there were the air defences operated by other countries, not by Russia. But to exported Russian air defences, they knew were not very good. But nobody knew how absolutely awful, how backward the Russian military is, and also how very weak their technology was. Putin boasted about its hypersonic missile, the Kinzhal, and saying that it would be able to evade any air defences from NATO. Patriot shoots down every single one, as long as it's got enough air interceptors to shoot them. So both the air defences and the air attacks, they're nothing like. So NATO is the other way around. So if NATO says that the range of something is 80 kilometres, chances are that with a bit of on the battlefield, with a little bit more work, you'll get it to fire 100 kilometres. I mean, that's just, they are very conservative in how they describe their weapon systems, and then they're more precise, they're better range, they can do more than they're rated to do, because they're very, very careful about their ratings. Russia's the other way around. They boast that their weapon systems do all sorts of things, and generally they can't do those things. Or on a very good day with the wind behind them, they might be able to. Then they'll put in, yes, they can do that. So it wasn't widely known anyway how very weak Russia was until the 2022 invasion. And this shows why Ukraine is not short on soldiers. So Yes, it's about the defence spending. So NATO's defence spending is vastly more than the Russian. And Ukrainian, they spend 22% of their GDP. They spend $43 billion. They spend roughly, actually more than a third of the amount that Russia spends, even though they're a much smaller country with a much lower GDP. So Ukraine itself spends quite a lot on defence spending because it's got a war economy. Russia hasn't really got a war economy. 6% of GDP is not a war economy. It's not very important for Russia in a way. The ordinary Russians, they don't feel that it's doesn't affect them that much, and Putin is doing everything he can to try not to affect them, not to have taxes, not to conscript all except the ethnic minorities. So Russia is not. He doesn't want to escalate and ramp up in a big way, because the ordinary Russian people wouldn't permit it. They wouldn't stand up for it, and he'd start getting a lot of unrest all over Russia. So then look at the number of people. Then again, it's less than 1% for Russia. It's over 2% for Ukraine, and then Russia's about 3 times the population. So this difference of between over 2% and under 1% is why Ukraine has nearly as many soldiers as Russia does, and these soldiers have much better equipment and they're much better trained. So they can actually do much more than the large number of Russian soldiers. So this is why Ukraine is not worried about the numbers of soldiers. So when they talk about a shortage, it turned out that their 500,000 was greatly exaggerated. It was 50,000 was the shortage, and Ukraine it's only a fraction of its fighting age soldiers that it actually sends to the war. In a population of 42 million, 900,000 is not that much, and it's reduced its, was it 27 or 26, I forget, it was 26 I think, it was 28, it reduced its youngest age for fighting to 26, for Russia it's 18. And the reason is because Ukraine is very focused on preserving its economy, preserving the skills of its people, and making sure that they complete the professional qualifications in whatever it is, nothing to do with the war, before they're conscripted. So its conscription starts at 26, which is very unusual. And in order to, so they don't end up in the army until they've completed their professional, until they've gone to university or college and completed whatever it is they do there. So they have a normal university and college in Ukraine, and then they have to go off and fight in the war. Some of them, whereas a lot of them go on to do normal jobs because they need to keep the economy going. So Ukraine does not have a shortage of soldiers. It has to make sometimes tough decisions about allowing people to go to war, which it wants to preserve for its, in order to maintain its economy. That's what that's about. So now I'm going to start talk about the legal situation. So the fighting. So this is another thing that people get very confused. I think they think that the supply of weapons to Ukraine is something to do with NATO. It's nothing to do with NATO. None of these weapons are being supplied onto the NATO convention. They are NATO countries, are many of them. Some are not NATO countries. I mean, Iceland is giving some support even, though it doesn't have any army, so it's just to do with medical things. But it's not a NATO operation. The North Atlantic Treaty is not in any way activated by Russia invading Ukraine, because Ukraine is not part of NATO. So all the support is under Article 51 of the UN Charter is why they're doing it, not under NATO. It's because Ukraine, legally it's because Ukraine has the right. And so it says here, nothing in the present Charter shall impair the inherent right of individual collective self-defense if armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations. And then the exception is until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace. So, if there was a Security Council authorised operation to ensure peace, then that inherent right is overridden because the Security Council has enforced peace. But that is not going to happen because Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, and it constantly vetoes any attempt to try and bring about enforced peace by the Security Council. So for that reason, then Ukraine has the inherent right to self-defense until whenever Russia stops vetoing all the attempts to enforce peace. So that's the legal situation. And then the UK, US and France are in a special situation. They see themselves as bound by the Budapest Memorandum. So this was in 1994, at the breakup of the Soviet Union. Then Ukraine back then, and Ukraine still is a military defense industrial base. It's very strong on military. It didn't have modern technology at the time of the war started, but it was producing a lot of military equipment for the rest of Europe and rest of the world. It was an exporter of military gear when the war started. And the reason that Russia attacked Ukraine instead of attacking Lithuania, which is far weaker, is because Lithuania, which doesn't even have a single fighter jet, was part of NATO. And is part of NATO. That shows how important NATO is. Instead it attacked this country, which was a major exporter of arms and had large amounts of ex-Soviet Union gear, because it used to be a hub of the Soviet Union defense industry. Ukraine used to be involved in making nukes and making ICBMs and putting nukes on ICBMs and things like that. And the nukes were always under the control of Moscow, so Ukraine never had control of the nukes, but it was all involved in making them. And so when the Soviet Union broke up, the big question was what's going to happen to all these nukes in Ukraine? And nobody wanted them to just stay in Ukraine. Not even Ukraine really wanted that, because Ukraine then would have been responsible for making sure that nobody steals them or whatever. So Ukraine agreed, and Ukraine, it obviously belonged to Russia rather than UK or USA. So they came to an agreement all together, Russia, UK, United States, and France. Why haven't I not mentioned? Sorry, not France. I thought France was involved. No, sorry, France is not involved. UK, I put... Yes, France. France is in... No, Russia. So UK, USA, Russia, and Ukraine, of course. Yes. So not France. Sorry about that. That's the Russian flag. So yes, I'll just edit that and remove France, because that's a mistake. Sorry. So UK and US see themselves as being bound by the Budapest Memorandum to help Ukraine, because in return Russia, UK and USA all agreed not to attack or threaten Ukraine, and gave surety assurances that they would help it if it was attacked, if it was invaded by anyone. So Russia, of course, has very seriously breached the Budapest Memorandum by attacking Ukraine. But UK and USA, they also signed that memorandum, so they are supporting Ukraine under a memorandum that Russia itself signed. UK and US are supporting Ukraine under that very same memorandum that Russia signed. So that is why UK and US has very, very strong support of Ukraine. They're required to under the Budapest Memorandum, and they're taking that more seriously, unlike Russia. So Article 5 does not give an invader sanctuary for missile systems, and nothing in international law gives any invaded country any protection against defensive country attacks. So if you invade a country, the Geneva Convention does not defend you, that does not protect you against being attacked back. But if you are defending, then under the Geneva Convention, not the Geneva Convention, sorry, the UN Charter. Did I say Geneva Convention? Sorry about that. Against the UN Charter. I sometimes come out with the wrong word. So the nothing in international law gives you any protection against defensive counteracts by the country you're invading. And this is just a picture of the Russian motorists waiting just across the border in Russia for a Grad to fire over the border into Ukraine, and Ukraine can't fire back to hit that Grad at present, but I'm pretty certain that it will be. Now, I also want to deal with some confusions that people have about NATO. So, the NATO treaty is not a treaty about counterattacking. It's a treaty just to prevent an attack. And the commitment ends once the attack stops. So, by Article 6, so if, for instance, Biden or an admiral or a general from NATO was visiting Ukraine and was killed by Russia, this would not be counted as an attack on NATO. It's only an attack if it's an attack on those people or on equipment or soldiers or aircraft, whatever, in the territory of a NATO country. That's under Article 6. When in or over those territories. And then this other bit doesn't apply anymore. That's to do with when the treaty was originally signed. They're just not relevant anymore. So in or over those territories. And the other thing is that Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, so this is to help people who, I'm losing track of the context here, so yeah, this is to help people who have who worry about what would happen if Russia was to attack NATO, if it was ever to attack NATO. Then NATO would not attack Russia back. No, it would not try to invade Russia if Russia was to try to invade NATO. It's not required to do that, it's not even permitted to do that. What NATO would do in that situation is defensive. It has to make sure that it stops the attack. Once the attack is over, the NATO treaty has been honoured. So many people don't understand that. They think that NATO treaty is some commitment that if Russia attacks NATO, then NATO has to invade Russia. That is not true at all. There's no commitment to invade Russia. So let's take an example that if Russia was to capture Narva, so suppose this is a very small extension of Estonia, and you could imagine that just like with Crimea, that Russia might send a few soldiers and maybe a tank or two over into Narva, and because Estonia's got hardly any military, then it might manage to keep control for a few minutes or hours or whatever. But what would happen? Well, NATO Estonia couldn't do very much in that situation, but NATO can. So Estonia would say to NATO, look, Russia has sent a detachment of 1,000 soldiers and a couple of tanks, and 10 tanks, and they've taken over Narva. Please help. Then right away, NATO has about 20,000 soldiers it can send there instantly, very, very quickly, within a couple of days. Some of them would be arriving faster than that, and the fighter jets would get there within hours. You would have the F-35s who would take over the airspace over Narva straight away. There's no way that Ukraine that Russia could take over the airspace. So it'd be, and probably the F-35s would just fire a few missiles down at and hit the tanks and these soldiers, and then they'd just scamper away like scolded cats. It's not likely that Russia would stay very long in Narva if it was to try to take it, and if NATO and if Estonia then asked for help to send them out again. So, and then suppose that happened, then that would be the end of it. NATO would not then counterattack Russia. So people have very, very strange ideas about NATO. NATO is not about, it doesn't say if Russia sends 1,000 soldiers and 10 tanks to take Narva, that NATO then has to drop nukes on Moscow. It's not like that at all. It's purely defensive. So I hope that will help some of you to understand. And NATO plans to increase that response force to 300,000. So even if Russia was to start building up soldiers outside Ukraine, like it did with Ukraine, it built up 200,000. Suppose it built them outside Lithuania, and it was ramping up soldiers to attack Lithuania, and it got 200,000 of them. By the time it got to 200,000, there would be 300,000 on the other side of the rapid response force. And normally you need a 3-to-1 ratio to invade. But this would just stop Russia from invading at all. So it doesn't mean that those 300,000 would ever be needed. They would just be a rapid response force that would appear straight away as soon as Russia tried to ramp up. And there's just no way that Russia could keep up with that. That's enough to stop 900,000. And even if Russia had 1 million, then it would take them months to build up an attack force of 1 million, mustering and in their camps and doing exercises just outside Lithuania. By then, other NATO countries would say, well, look, we've got to make sure we've got more than the Russians have on our side. And there'll probably be 2 million by then. So it's just never going to happen that Russia is going to attack NATO, because NATO is just far too strong, far more numerous. NATO's got 3 million soldiers. Russia potentials got 3 million in the military in all its countries that could be sent to help us take Estonia or Lithuania or whatever. It's just not going to happen. So NATO has to do those wargaming, but it does that wargaming to stop Russia from attacking them. And I talked about how perhaps by 2030 Russia will have its 4th generation fighter jet. By then that is when US expects to have its 5th generation fighter jet, which would be even harder to spot than this supersonic potato thing. So then just to talk about a few other things that people are worried about, and I'm going to talk at the end a little bit about why Putin is not going to just do things out of pure madness. That's what I'll end with, but I'll talk a little bit more about some other things. So there's this proposal for Poland to shoot down missiles heading over Ukraine towards Poland. So this is much misunderstood. The Polish plan is just defensive. You can't tell if a cruise missile is flying. I should expand that a little bit and explain. If a cruise missile is flying over Ukraine and Poland don't know how it's programmed. It could be a mistake in its programming. There have been some missiles that have flown and have hit Poland, and just one or two, I think. Oh, hit Romania. They suddenly hit Romania, and there was an accident in Poland that just very near the border, and they were either misprogrammed or deliberately programmed slightly over the border, or more likely misprogrammed. And then sometimes things go wrong with them and they get mistakes. So it's entirely legitimate for Poland to shoot down these missiles maybe 10, 20, 30 kilometers before they reach the Polish border, just in case they're going to hit Poland of Ukrainian territory. Ukraine wants it to do that because that would cover Lviv if it went as far as 30 kilometers. That would make it very much simpler, and Ukraine could move its Patriot system out of Lviv. But from Poland's point of view, it would just be protecting Poland. Well, this is a very grey area thing, and NATO doesn't. NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, he said in that in the same interview that he said that it's that I talked about, where he said that it's totally just self-defense for Ukraine. He does not approve Poland shooting down Russian cruise missiles over Ukraine, even though there's no real way that Russia is not going to. If Poland does shoot down those missiles, there's no way that Russia is going to attack Poland over that. It's very clear legitimate self-defense, but NATO is hyper cautious, and it's not going to. It doesn't want to permit that. But when we come to Ukraine firing missiles over a front line into Russia, it's just totally and ambiguously just defense, self-defense. And for Stoltenberg, the two situations may seem familiar to people who don't know this very well, but for people like Jens Stoltenberg, they're different as chalk and cheese, as they say. Now this is the bit that I'll end with this, about how Russia is never going to use nukes. So Putin, he cares about many things. So Putin is he's not an oligarch. He's not someone who just wants to be wealthy and doesn't care about anything else. He's not there just to siphon away money. He is very wealthy, but that's not his motive, even though he probably has siphoned away quite a lot. But he is, his motive as for president is not to be wealthy. If that was his motive, then he would have just been an oligarch. He would probably left Russia and gone to somewhere safer, or somewhere, or he might have stayed an oligarch in Russia and lived out his life as an oligarch. So the only reason that Putin is president of Russia is because he cares about Russia. It's the only thing that makes sense. It's a very difficult, it's risky being a president. You know, he's got to worry all the time about whether someone might be wanting to assassinate him. He's in the spotlight. He's got lots of problems with his decisions and so on. He has to have some motivation other than just being his own personal comfort and wanting to be wealthy and things like that. That's not his motivation. And it doesn't seem to be just that he's on a power trip either. It's much more that he cares about Russian and Russian culture and Russianness. And he doesn't care about individuals, though, which is quite hard, kind of what we find hard to understand. Rational but ruthless is how it's been described. And this is something that ordinary Russians, apparently, many of them, especially the ethnic minorities and the peasant people, and not very well educated Russians, then they think of themselves as having a kind of duty to patriotic duty to fight for their country. And they're fighting in Ukraine, not really because they understand really why they're fighting there, just patriotically because they've been told to do it. So Russia has this thing about a patriotic duty to fight, and about the leader being like a Tsar who tells the minions what to do. So Putin believes in that too. So that's really why he's doing what he's doing, and where his ruthlessness comes from too. Not really caring about individual human beings, but caring a lot about Russianness. And if he has to be ruthless to do what he wants to do by way of becoming a Russian empire, then he does it. That's really how Putin thinks. And he cares hugely about things like the Red Square and about Fabergé eggs. He can talk for hours about Fabergé eggs, the imperial Fabergé eggs, which were bought by an oligarch friend. And he wouldn't be president of Russia if he didn't care. He'd buy himself a comfortable home like a Russian oligarch. He'd buy himself a multi-billion-dollar yacht or something. He'd retire from politics. He might leave Russia like some of the Russian oligarchs have, and live in other countries that are more comfortable. So no, if he used a nuke, he would lose everything that he has ever um, working for his entire life. There was even neutral support from India and China. I should put a link there about the neutral support for India and China. And Russia would become a rogue nation. I've got a blog post about that. And he wouldn't win. And you can't win with nukes. It's simply impossible. No country has ever had a capability to win a war with nukes. Ukraine, I've talked about that I think in other videos, and I've got blog posts about it. But Russia doesn't have even one nuke for every US and UK military base, never mind all the NATO military bases, and never mind all the destroyers in the sea and the places where fighter jets might disperse to and bombers might disperse to. And many of those bases are hardened against nukes, so there's no way that Russia can destroy the conventional capability of NATO, which is vastly superior to Russia, using nukes. So you can't win a war with nukes. And nowadays, the NATO, certainly the United States, and almost surely NATO as well, and especially given how weak it's been in the war, if Russia used a single nuke, if he used a single one-tactical nuke in Ukraine, then he has been told that he will see his entire Black Sea fleet sunk by neat, precise conventional bombs developed by NATO, which he can't stop. It's probably that. So that's General Petraeus who speculated that, but he's used to be in position to know such things. He can now talk about it publicly because he isn't privy to whatever was secretly told to Russia, to Putin. But likely hitting targets in the Black Sea and targets across Ukraine with conventional missiles, and then that would be the end of Putin as Prime Minister, as President. It would just be so much shame on him. They'd have to find another president if he did that. And he'd lose the neutral support from India and China. He'd likely be handed over to the ICC after something like that if he'd use a nuke in Ukraine. So there's no way he's going to do that in reality. But making these bluffs over and over again, that is something that, from his point of view, with his for most of us, seems very strange, bizarre man with very strange ideas. But it's coherent thought. So he's not insane. So he can't be trusted. It's not about trusting Putin. It's about whether he has coherent thoughts at all. And he sets these bizarre red lines that I've talked about already. His very first red line, I think, was he said that he'd do some unspecified escalation if Europe was to sanction Russia. Europe sanctioned Russia, Russia did nothing. He said that he would escalate in a vague way which implied nukes if Finland and Sweden joined NATO. Finland and Sweden joined NATO, he did nothing. He's done this over and over, and if I kept saying over and over and over as many times as he's done it, then you get very bored because we go on for a minute or two, probably. He keeps, if I were to keep count and then say over and over that many times, he's done it so often. Now, this all confirms that he is a ruthless, sane person bluffing. He bluffs in order to delay. So he's managed to prevent NATO from sending 1970s technologies, F-17s, F-16, sorry, I said the wrong number, since 2022 by bluffing, just by using words, nothing else. They could have sent them in 2022, and now we're in 2024, and they still don't have them, and they get the first few in summer. He did that just with words. So his words, his bluffs are very powerful. And he's managed to delay the Patriot through to spring 2023, just using words. He's delayed ATACMS through to a few in the fall 2023, but most just now. Again, using nothing but words, just bluffing. So his bluffs are sane in that sense because he achieves something with them. And he gets this reinforcement over and over again. If you bluff like this, it works. So that's why he does it. He is being told over and over again, he gets this very clear reinforcement, if he bluffs, then NATO is hesitant. So he constantly bluffs. He's being encouraged to bluff by the way NATO responds to him. But as soon as NATO crosses a red line, he then does nothing, because there's no benefit to Russia to do anything. He's escalating as much as he can in Ukraine. He can't use nukes, it's total madness. So every time that NATO crosses one of those bizarre red lines and Putin does nothing, this just confirms, which has been obvious all along, and Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and Poland and Ukraine have known this since day one, that his bluffs are just bluffs. And he is not a cartoon character acting out of incoherent madness. He is not a bizarre video character. He is not a James Bond villain. He is a real person who is capable of coherent thought and is acting out of coherent, sane, rational but ruthless thought. And this has been confirmed over and over again with every red line that has been crossed. It confirms that he is not this bizarre cartoon character that people are afraid he might be, who just acts out of incoherent madness. He isn't. Now, he did make one very major mistake when he invaded Ukraine. He expected to be able to take over Ukraine in a time period of within a few days to a few weeks. He had been informed falsely by people who lied to him, probably, that if he was going to set up this air bridge between Russia and Hostomel airport, and all the rest was just a distraction for that, all the other attacks around Ukraine. And then with that air bridge, which was stopped by not very well trained but very brave Ukrainians with some NATO supplied Javelin anti-tank things and so on, and the Stinger anti-aircraft things helped quite a bit with that. But they managed to hold back and they held Hostomel airport just for long enough to make it impossible for Russia to take it, because then Ukraine could send in more reinforcements and Russia did take it, but it was so damaged they couldn't use it very much, and then all their helicopters and transport planes were being shot down as well, and so they never managed to set up this land bridge, this air bridge but their plan was to then set up this air bridge and then drive with tanks and so on into Kiev, and they expected very quickly, they expected the Ukrainians to welcome them and say, cheers, hooray, Russia's come to liberate us, and they expected the Ukrainian military to immediately flip over to being controlled by Russia. Putin had completely misunderstood the situation in Ukraine. So that was a very bad mistake he made. And then he didn't have a plan B. So everything since then has been improvising. I'm sure that if Putin could go back in the time machine, he'd tell himself in spring 2022 not to do this invasion. You've been lied to. This is a mistake. But having committed, and he felt he couldn't go back again. By then he'd already taken over quite large areas of Ukraine. And then he felt he had to continue with this. So that's basically what this war is about. Putin just but then he's lost half of that. It doesn't mean he's not going to lose, but he's hanging in there and he's trying to present it as a win to the Russians. Even if he has to lose all that territory, he'll have to present it as a win in some sense. He's a good enough propagandist that he might be able to do that. So I think that some of this is from people watching lots of movies, getting strange ideas from cartoon characters, and possibly from video games also, where I don't play video games, but from video games I've looked at, and you have little bits about it, and you have little snippets of people playing it. The opponents you have in video games, they're essentially insane. They're not normal people thinking like normal people. And it's part of the way they've just accepted the scenario that you're in. you're fighting against people who just don't think like people. And so maybe that leads to people not thinking that Putin could be like that, but he can't be like that. That is not a legitimate way that a human person can think or act. So no, Putin is a real person, and he's not going to just act in a bizarre, incoherent, mad way out of incoherent madness, nor will his generals. And then, if you imagine his generals, then they imagine suppose Putin just wakes up and he says, "Go and drop a bomb. I've had enough." Like someone might do when they're in a bizarre mood and they wake up and they're very, very strange, bizarre mood and they've had a nightmare and they just say something very bizarre. Then the generals will just say no, and then even though they're yes men, but they can see that this is just something bizarre he's saying. Doesn't make sense at all. And if Putin was to continue with that, they'd see that Putin's gone mad. There's no sign that Putin will go mad or could go mad, but they don't have the Article 14 like the US do. But I'm sure the admirals, they'd improvise something. They'd ring up and say, "Putin's gone mad. Sorry, Putin. There's a glitch here. They're not able to fire the missiles," and they'd say something like that, and then they, "Does anyone have a pistol or a tranquilizer or something?" and then they try and work out what they could do about this situation, whispering around to each other and then delaying Putin. There's no way that the generals would actually really accept. They're not real yes men in the sense that they would allow a mad person to do something mad. And that'd be like someone ordering them to step off the top of a skyscraper. They wouldn't do that. So anyway, we don't need to. He's a real person, and his generals are real people. They're not cartoon characters either. Oh, I've misspelled that as well. Change that. So now this is about what the Admiral Radican, Britain's defence chief. So some of these things that I've said, and this Admiral Radican saying those same things. So he said that Russia will lose and lose quickly, and for that reason Putin does not want war with NATO. The biggest reason that Putin does not want conflict with NATO is because Russia will lose and lose quickly. And he talked about how operational level Russia has demonstrated its continued inability to fight in a joint way. Its air force has failed to gain control of the air, like I said. Its navy has seen 25% of the vessels sunk by a country without a navy. It's lost nearly 3,000 tanks. It's now lost over 3,000 tanks, and this is by direct visual evidence of every single one. And over 5,000 armoured fighting vehicles. And so he's saying it's significantly less capable than we anticipate following its disastrous illegal invasion into Ukraine. So it's got an even stronger straight bracket with Finland and Sweden. So it's demonstrated with the aggression that it is dangerous, but it is no match for NATO. So it's simply just not strong enough, even though they're obviously very aggressive and doing things that are against the international law. And so Putin is willing to disobey international law and the Budapest Memorandum and all sorts of things. In that sense, it's dangerous. But it's not a risk to NATO because NATO can easily stop it. So, and the biggest reason that Putin doesn't want a conflict with NATO is because Russia will lose and lose quickly. Okay, that's it. I think I've covered everything here now. So, okay, so that's I think it's about an hour and a quarter. I just want to say a little bit at the end. I'll just say these last 10 bits and then I'll wrap up. So this a post that could get comments from people who just read the title, so that's why I disable comments. Just say a little bit about why I say that. And these, so I used to get reasonably sensible comments, and so but then a few weeks ago or so, and I started to get these comments from people who just didn't read the titles. I think it's because my articles got more popular, and they started appearing a bit. Sometimes you find them up near the top in Google search results, for instance, and so I think people outside of Quora are sharing them, and you also probably people in their Quora newsfeed. So I started getting people when I first post an article, then I get people coming and commenting on them, saying things that showed they hadn't even read the title. Or they hadn't even read the article, they just read the title, and immediately they saw it in Google, they clicked on it, and they saw the title in Google and a little snippet, and they said, I don't agree with that. They click on it, and then they go and make a comment saying this is nonsense, and they haven't even read the article, and this scared the people that I help. So I disable comments when they're first posted, so that I wait until hopefully they've got look way down in search results anywhere before I enable comments again, for anything that might encourage comments like that. And then this is, you can contact me, and I get lots and lots of messages, so please bump the message and say again if I don't answer, because I do miss messages sometimes. You get me fastest on Facebook. And then do go and join our Facebook group on Facebook. And I should say, if you could help with fact checking, I forgot to say here that also if you can help with helping scared people, with if you are good, and of course obviously if you're scared, then you're very welcome in our Doomsday Facebook group. And then also, if you're good at helping people who are panicking, and occasionally, very occasionally, someone suicidal even, if you are good at helping people like that, just responding and just saying ordinary things, saying, talk a bit about what's worrying you, this is, and then say, well, I've seen this debunked before, someone I'm sure will come along with a fact check in a minute or two, and meanwhile I'm here to kind of reassure you. People who do that sort of thing also are very, very useful in our group, because the fact checkers just can't keep up with the, can't respond instantly, and there are a lot of people who help in that way. And I see them as being like the first responders, and quite a lot of them, and we have quite a lot of members with expertise in lots of different areas who can help in various areas, to get people posting saying, I do that, I do this, and this is based on my own knowledge of this topic. So again, if you can fact check in some very limited area, say about earthquakes or something, then then that's very helpful, because we get quite a lot of questions about those. But also, if you can, and if you've got good background in astronomy, good background in lots of topics, that where if it's very helpful if you've got a good background in those topics as fact checkers. And but there are also lots of areas where helping people. A lot of our members have anxiety disorders. A lot of because those are the people who tend to panic and need help, and they come here and they need help. And so we're not helping with we're not psychologists, we're not psychiatrists, we're not therapists. But if you have a background in that, you may be able to help these people who are having difficulty making contact with a therapist in their area and things like that. And you might help people who are anxious, just responding in first response kind of ways of helping people who are anxious and so on. And so anything like that is also very, very helpful with our group. So we welcome fact checkers, anyone who can help the scared people in any way, emergency response kind of things to people who are panicking, and anyone who can help with fact checking. And so yeah, that's it. Oh, that's about the graphics for the episode. Right, so that's it, that's the end. And this is, I think it's now in 20 minutes. And so, anyway, I hope you found that helpful. And I'll upload this on YouTube. And I'll make those fixes in the article, in the blog post that I mentioned. I'll put the link to this blog post. I'll do the copy on Substack, because it doesn't blur the graphics for one thing, whereas you may have noticed that I had to click on a graphic to unblur it, which Quora does automatically for anything on any topic to do with war. It blurs all the graphics, it seems, and so so you just have to click on each topic, but none of our graphics are, they're all family friendly, young kids can read them. So there's no reason to blur anything. Anyway, so I'll put it up on I've got it on Substack. I'll fix those things, copy them over. I'll put, as soon as the video goes up, then I'll put a link in the video description to the copy of this on Substack, and so click through there to read it and find out more.